What's going on, everyone? I'm back for the second part of my return to Over the Board Chess recap series. And in this part, I'm going to be looking at my top 5 moves that backfired. I was originally thinking about making a video on my top 5 blunders, but, blunders can be fun to look at. Everyone's had games where maybe their concentration slipped and whatnot, they blundered a rook, but I think it'll be a little bit more instructive to look at my top 5 moves where I was convinced they were good and that they were going to help me win, but they ended up actually costing me the game. So the first example is from a local club game from Westfield, New Jersey back in 2019. And my opponent and I reached this position after 38 moves. Very close kind of structure. My opponent's king is a little bit kind of out in the open, but pretty safe behind all the pawns. And he actually just played this move, queen to c8, and I was very determined to win this game. I was thinking, what can I do? How can I find a breakthrough? And not much of a breakthrough on this side of the board. I mean, maybe I can sacrifice a pawn and play something like this, but no guarantee that it's going to help me because he can always cover with his rook. So after thinking for a little bit, and I was actually getting kind of low on time, I had maybe less than 10 minutes left, I decided to play the move g4 with the idea to kind of open the g file, maybe make a passed h-pawn, maybe find a breakthrough. Thought it was going to help me win, but he just took en passant, and after I took back, he played the calm move king c6, actually using his king to blockade the pawns, but it's going to be totally safe. And it quickly turned out that instead of me being able to play for the win, he was now the one playing for the win because I just gifted him an open h-file. He has now really easy access to attack my pawn on f4, and there's not much I can do about it. I tried to sort of defend, but he just came in with his queen. And I actually do not have the record of the game past this point because I was very low on time. When you're under 5 minutes in a USCF tournament, you're allowed to stop writing down your moves. And I don't have an exact record of what happened, but what I can tell you is I gradually got outplayed. Eventually, he was able to push this d-pawn through, and I lost the game. Very painful because I was sure that I could play for the win if I play this move g4, but really, it turns out that in this position, there's not really a good way to go for a win. A lot of times, the harder you push for a win, the more you jeopardize yourself, and you might actually end up losing. So I really should have just kind of sat back, maybe moved around a little bit, and it probably just would have been a draw because neither of us have an easy way through without compromising our positions. So tough lesson to learn, and we'll definitely see more examples of that. So this next example, number 4, was actually against a friend of mine. We were on the same team for the Rutgers chess team, played in a few tournaments together, but this was an individual tournament back in September 2019. And we were facing each other in the second round of a small tournament, and I got a pretty good position out of the opening. We actually just traded queens. And he played the move rook d3, and materially it's totally equal, but structurally I have a much better position because I have a very strong bishop on this diagonal, and my pawns kind of stop his knights from doing anything. Really, all I needed to do here was just slowly improve my position with a move like rook c8 and just go for some kind of a queenside attack. And it's actually very hard for white to do anything. He just really has no way to break through the pawns, and he would be kind of playing for a draw at this point. But I got a little bit over-ambitious in this position, and I saw the fact that I have this bishop pinning, the knight. Looks pretty promising. So I decided to play the move e5. And my idea was, well, I'm threatening to go e4 and fork his knight and rook. And how does he stop me? He can't move the knight because he's in a pin. If he moves the rook, then I can still play this move because I have 2 pieces defending. So I was certain that I was about to win a piece. I'm like, what can he do? And he was actually worried too. He didn't know what to do at first, but then he found the simple move takes, and rook here. And now I'm no longer threatening a fork, because if I play e4, he will just kind of sidestep, and my pawn over here might actually be a bit of a liability. So in this position, I now played the move rook to d8, which was a little bit inaccurate already, and he just played rook e1, and now he's completely out of the pin, and my pawn is just hanging, no longer defended. Before it was totally stable, now it's a liability. I was forced to give up my bishop, but I got into a position where I was now on the back foot from a position where I was comfortably better. And for the rest of the game, he basically pressed and pressed, and I wasn't much worse. I could have survived, but maybe I was a bit tilted from having messed up. And eventually, some moves later, he traded the knights off, and I actually made a very silly move here with g5, and after rook g7, I resigned. Whereas really, I could have still probably fought on if I had taken the pawn and tried to go for some counterplay. I'm obviously going to lose the f-pawn, but with 2 pawns on this side against 3 pawns on that side, still chances to draw. But I was just kind of maybe tired, maybe tilted, and in this position just blundered the pawn. But it all kind of started from that position where I was definitely better, right? Had this nice pin, but more importantly, just a solid structure. I didn't need to play this move, but I got a bit overambitious, and this was my number 4 move that backfired. So my number 3 of my top 5 moves that backfired is actually against the same opponent, my buddy. This was a game earlier that same year, actually, in April of 2019. And it was a very close game. I was a bit better in the beginning, but kind of like missed some chances. And we reached this rook endgame, pretty equal position, equal material, 6 pawns each. But I was a bit worried that he could maybe play the move something like a4 and break through on this side. And I was also still trying to play for the win, so I played the move rook b5. And in hindsight, I can't even explain this move. I don't know what this move honestly does. I think maybe my plan was that if he plays a4, I can just take and win a pawn. But what I failed to realize is that by moving my rook away, I was giving up control of the only open file. And he simply played rook f8, saying, go ahead and take my pawn, I'm going to bring in my rook. And at this point, there was just no going back. I mean, if I go back with rook f5, he takes, and his king comes in, and his king is much closer. I mean, he's just going to take my pawn, and he's winning the game. So I had to just go all in and take, but now he comes in at the rook, and suddenly he's the first to make a pass pawn, and he just cleans it up on that side, and I am just way too slow. We both end up making queens, but he queens first. And after a couple of checks, I resigned because I'm simply about to get ladder checkmated. My queen and rook are way too far away to offer my king any sort of protection. And it's about to be game over. So another game in which I threw away a probably drawn position, very equal. I mean, all I needed to do in this position, honestly, was just kind of shift around my king. He could try to make a breakthrough, but it's not really going to lead to anything because he never actually is able to enter via the A file. My king is always there to protect. But another example of being a bit too ambitious and not realizing how things can very quickly go wrong. So for my number 2 move, there's arguably 2 moves that kind of like factor into one element of me just over evaluating my position. Basically, this was a Sicilian, I think a Najdorf, very sharp opening from a club game back in 2018. I just traded my bishop for his knight. And kind of a weird position. I have these pawns over here. He has basically 2 passed pawns right now. And my best bet in this position would have been to play knight d5 and then trade my knight for the bishop and then take here. And he can kind of like try to seal up his king side, but I'm still slightly better. Instead, I played the move pawn takes h6 because I was very eager to break through and attack his king. And I was like, I'm right there at the doorstep. All I need to do is activate my rook or queen, and I'm pretty much winning this thing. But by taking this pawn here, I allowed him to play the move bishop b4 and pin my knight down. And already I was realizing that probably shouldn't have allowed that. because now I can't really move my knight, and if I move my queen away, he's going to take and double my pawns. But I said, you know what, whatever, I'm right there. I'm going to take on g7. If he takes the king, I bring in my queen, and he's practically checkmated. So I was, feeling pretty confident about my position, but then he simply played the move rook d8. I had just completely missed the fact that he didn't have to take this pawn. It wasn't with check. And now I am definitely in trouble. If we go back a move, I could have still saved myself with the move queen d4, hitting the bishop and threatening checkmate. After he takes, and this trade happens, he would then have to play f6 just to cover up. And then, some sharp position would ensue. Queens and rooks still on the board. Kind of hard to see or to figure out what's really happening, but I'm certainly not like dead lost or anything. Maybe I'm a bit better, maybe it's a draw, who knows, but certainly not as bad as what happened in the game, because after rook d8, my queen's hit, and once it moves out of the way, he takes this, comes in at the queen, he's threatening checkmate on a1, I have to sidestep, and he basically played the rest of this game pretty well. He just kind of defended his pawns. I tried to come in and threaten mate, but he's obviously going to stop it. Then I played this move, kind of a bluff. And eventually, this was a fancy kind of attempt by me, kind of baiting him so that he would take, and I'm left with a pass pawn. But he wasn't going to fall for any tricks. He just sidestepped. And eventually, he was able to make a second queen. And I resigned once he eliminated my last hopes of some Hail Mary checkmate. So, yeah, that was kind of a bad move that backfired in this case, because it should be pretty obvious that taking this pawn is not going to force him to take back, which I kind of like tunnel visioned on. I really just missed that he can just simply play rook d8 and I'm in big trouble. But yeah, that was a tough lesson, and my number 2 move that backfired. So for my number 1 move that backfired, I had to dip deep into my archives and pull out one of my first ever scorebooks from tournament play. This was actually a game in the 2008 World Amateur Team East, a team tournament. I featured a game from the 2019 version in my top 5 moves, and this was actually the first iteration of that tournament that I ever played. I'd only been playing competitively for less than 2 years, maybe like a year and a few months at that point, and I was already about 1200 at the time, although I remember my rating used for that tournament was like only 950 or something, because it was a couple months behind and I had been making pretty good progress. But in this game, I was playing against a guy who told me he was unrated, but really had a provisional rating of about 1500, so he was a pretty strong opponent, and we actually played, or I should say I played a Knight Orphan in this game, which is interesting because I didn't even know that I had played that up until I checked this game, and it turns out that, yeah, I did. But anyway, we reached this position. I had actually sacrificed the pawn, and in this position, I went for like a very weird, flashy move, bishop d2. I guess I was just trying to show that he can't take my bishop with his knight, and if he takes the queen, then I take his knight, and I'm hitting g4. Kind of unnecessary, but I had been reading a lot of like tactics books and stuff, and I was like very much trying to be fancy and flashy and find some crazy combination. So he was just like, okay, rook d1. And in this position, I played a move which is quite honestly just inexplicable, but like I said, I was very much trying to be fancy, and I was trying to like show some kind of a Tal spark. And so I played the move rook takes f2, and I was basically convinced that he had to take by queen, and once he did, I would now take on g4 with a fork. I was basically sacrificing my rook, winning 2 pawns, then I was going to give this check, trade, and then take the rook, and I mean, how beautiful. I come out up a pawn. What an amazing combination, right? I'm basically Michal Tal. But once I took, my opponent just kind of confusedly looked at me and just took with the king. And I was like, oh, I had totally tunnel visioned on the queen taking, hadn't even considered what happens if he just takes with the king. And what happens is that I'm just now down a rook and I'm dead lost, and I resigned. And I remember, because this was a team tournament, I was on the last board. My teammate just looked over at me like, dude, what are you doing? You just had a good position. Why did you do that? And I couldn't explain it to him. I just thought that I found some amazing tactic, and it turned out that it did not work at all. So just goes to show you got to always calculate all your opponent's possible replies, and don't try to be super flashy. It can backfire. So yeah, hope you enjoyed. Those are my top 5 moves that kind of went wrong. Happens in chess. You know, sometimes you miss something, or you think that your move is really good, but you miss a refutation. That's just how the game goes, and we learn from those moments.